to South Vietnam. Emily sent me off from Atlanta, and I flew to San Francisco, and then I don't remember, but I got up to Travis Air Force Base in some way. And I was looking forward to the flight because I had been told that I would be on the embassy flight, and it sounded pretty plush to me. Well, I found out that really the embassy flight was a transport plane. It had about 20 seats in it that sat backwards, very primitive, no lining on the inside of it. And we took off from there, went out to Hawaii, and when we came down, I noticed that there was a lot of leaking of water inside. And I learned later that the rivets would frost over when we were at height, and we came down, and the water would then go into the passenger area there. We did stop at Hawaii. We took off again, went on to the Philippines, spent the night in the Philippines. I suspect maybe they had some equipment that had to be taken off there to go to the embassy. And then the next day, we flew on to Saigon. We had an orientation in Saigon, really in Cho Lan. It's a suburb of the main city of Saigon, but that's where the MACV, Military Assistance Command Vietnam headquarters was. And that's where we got our orientation, which lasted 2 or 3 days. I remember that they were telling us about the activities and the level of operations in each of these areas, and they told us that in the south, in the Mekong Delta area, and that's 4th Corps, that was the heaviest contact and heaviest activity. And it sort of diminished as you went up. The 3rd Corps, 2nd Corps, and 1st Corps was at the northern edge of old South Vietnam. I was sort of surprised, but not unexpectedly, when I got my orders and was told that I would be going to 4th Corps. The 4th Corps sent vehicle up, picked us up. We traveled back to Mito, and then there I got an orientation, then on down to Ben Tre, and I was assigned to the 1st Battalion of the 10th Regiment of the Vietnamese Army. That was part of this 7th ARVN Division, which is down in that area just south of Saigon and down to the Mekong River. My battalion's base really was in Ben Tre, which is a town south of Mito by about 10 miles or so. And there I met my unit. I guess I met someone from the unit, and they took me out to where the battalion was located. At that time, the battalion was in the Plain of Reeds, big open area, wide, flat, as far as you can see. And the Vietnamese were dredging a canal through there, and we had the responsibility to secure the dredge that was in that area. They would make some progress each day, and we'd move up and provide the security. But it was very open, and we were strictly defensive, and we did not have contact in that area at all. Right after Christmas of 1963, we left the dredge and moved back into the Ben Tre province, Mukwa, and there we began to operate. There was a big operation that they decided to conduct down on the South China Sea, along the coastline there, where the Mekong, the delta spreads out and moves across there, and therefore we were to move into that area and to conduct operations there. It was totally a Viet Cong area, and our job was to destroy anything that was in that area because it was all Viet Cong. We were in the second lift to go into a landing zone. The helicopters came back, and I noticed the crews were all out looking at the helicopters real close. They went down there to see what they had. Lots of holes. They had been shot at quite a bit. We didn't lose any helicopters, but there were lots of holes in the helicopters. 2 hours later, we left, and we landed, our battalion landed, in a landing zone that had probably been used by the previous unit to drop in, although they had departed and we didn't see anybody from that unit. Lots of noise, and there were 4 or 5 bodies of Viet Cong on the ground, and the helicopters' rotors were going, making noise. There was gunfire, and there was women screaming, and all of this finally got a little bit quiet, except for the screaming women. And I went over to see what was happening there, and it was in a bunch of shrubs, and I made my way back through the shrubs, and I saw 2 women squatting, facing each other. Got a little closer, and I saw there was a hole in between, and they were crying and screaming. And closer I got, the louder the noise they made. I couldn't figure out what the problem was. And when I got there and looked down in the hole, I saw that there was a baby that had been killed, I guess, in this previous assault. I moved out quickly. I should have done something to try to help, but it just didn't occur to me at the time. I went back to where the main part of the headquarters was. There was also one dead body in that area, and suddenly a soldier got down real low and started crawling toward the body, and everybody else got down. I was just standing watching as they crawled over, and then they started yelling to me to get down, and I got down, and then he pulled at the body. The idea, often these bodies were booby-trapped, and they were trying to make sure that nobody got hurt, and therefore everybody was down low. I had been taught that, I knew that, but I didn't really appreciate it until I actually experienced the situation. It tells you can learn in the classroom about things, but you don't always remember until you actually are confronted by that situation. We moved out toward our objective, and we had some helicopters in support, gunships, and they usually had 4 Americans in there as a crew, and then 1 Vietnamese observer, and then they would support us in the attack. While we were moving forward, one of the helicopters got shot down. It wasn't near us, but they had gotten word that it had gone down, and we kept moving to where we thought the helicopter was. We were held up, and it was late at night, not really late, but 10 o'clock or so, that they finally allowed us to stop rather than to continue to try to hunt for the helicopter. I remember that night I slept on the dike, woke up the next morning, and some of the Vietnamese said, Dawee, come. And Dawee is captain, and they pointed out a place that I could see in the distance was it had been fire. It had been a blast into the sand and down in. And I walked toward it, and as I walked toward it, I could see the form of one fella. It was burnt, no features on the head, no fingers on the hands, but it looked like he was crawling out of the hole. The knees were down, one hand was down, one hand was in the air, but it was absolutely couldn't be identified. It was burnt to a crisp, and hanging around his neck were the dog tags. And I said, wow, what a sight. Poor fellow trying to get away from this thing, and it evidently been burned at the end. I looked down into the crater behind, and I saw 4 large bodies and 1 small body, and I could see the dog tags, identification tags, on each one of those soldiers also. Shortly after that, our battalion moved out again, and people from the headquarters came in to secure the remains of those soldiers. I never knew who they were until recently, and I started looking on the wall in Vietnam. Names, I remember it was around mid-January, and I did find the names of all 4 of those soldiers who were killed, and I read about it, and there was a description of how they had died, and it fit exactly what I remembered of that event. We stayed on this operation for about 3 weeks, and I remember going into an area one time, and we burnt down all the huts. We knew all these people were enemy, and we captured 2 of their soldiers, and we stopped at midday, and I went over in an area to listen to them interrogating these soldiers. And they would talk, and the soldiers would answer in some way. Finally, I couldn't understand very much of what was being said. I got up, went on back, and had my lunch. We got ready to move out, and I heard gunfire, and I thought it was someone that was just test firing a weapon. We moved out, and we went on about an hour or so, and I said, well, where are our prisoners? And they said, the Vietnamese, my battalion group, told me, well, we killed them because they wouldn't cooperate with us. They were lying to us. And I said, well, you shouldn't have killed them. We should have turned them back so that they could be interrogated at higher levels. Well, I wasn't really knowing. They didn't have any way of getting rid of the soldiers. And what their view was, well, we'll just have to care for them. We'll have to feed them until we can finally find someone that'll take them off our hands. So they chose a route that I wouldn't have chosen. But anyway, that's what happened. We were in deep swamps a lot of the time. And at one point, I remember, and this is another case of learning for yourself, I leaned against a tree, and I didn't notice that none of the Vietnamese soldiers did. There were ants that would just sting the devil out of you. So they watched me leaning against the tree, and all of a sudden I jumped and swatted and so forth. And again, that's an advisor who's there to advise somebody else, but in many ways doesn't know as much about the area as they do. There's certain things the advisor's good at. Well, I learned a lesson. We went on through this swampy water up to your thigh, and moved for quite a distance, and we were out of food, and we needed a resupply. And we came out onto a watermelon field, and the troops were all running out in the field, grabbing watermelons and coming back in. About a half a mile away, there was some fire at us, but it was not aimed and it wasn't coming anywhere near, so it didn't slow the troops down. They would grab watermelon. I did it too, and run back in the trees to eat. We then called for a resupply, and a helicopter, one of these banana helicopters, came in. He had an escort ship with him. Well, I went over to I had a letter that I wanted to send to Emily, and I went over to leaned in the door, got the crew chief's headset, and talked to the pilot. He turned around, he had his goggles down and so forth, and seemed real friendly, and I said, would you mail this letter to my wife? And here's some, I guess I gave him a flag or a rifle or some things, some Viet Cong items. And he said, sure, I'll take care of it for you. What's the best way out of here? And I said, well, we came in from that direction, so I think if you lift out there, that's probably a safe area. In the meantime, there was a gunship overhead circling all the time. He lifted out and went exactly like I told him to, the gunship right alongside him. And right when they got to the edge of the woods, I never saw so much fire come up at the helicopters. There were flares coming up. There were tracers coming up. There were machine gun fire coming up. And the helicopters just put, kept moving on. By the way, they had supplied us with water and rice when I asked them that. Thank goodness they got out, and I said, boy, and I gave the guy the instructions to go that way. At another point in this 3-week operation, I remember one night we came upon a building, looked like it was fairly new, and of course dirt for floor, but it had tall columns inside and a nice terracotta roof. And in front was a flagpole. We put our flag up on there, and I stretched my hammock out between two of the columns inside and was getting a good night's sleep. And all of a sudden there was a tremendous amount of gunfire, and it was at the roof, and it was tearing up this terracotta roof. This new terracotta roof was on the building, and the terracotta was falling inside where we were sleeping. So you couldn't tell whether there were rounds being fired at you or the piece of the terracotta had fallen on you. Anyway, we quickly got a unit out there, and they ceased to fire and ran off, but that was a night disturbed. We operated in that area for about 3 weeks and had a number of contacts, but then the operation was called off, and I remember going back to the place they called the seminary there, where the headquarters of the advisory group for the Vietnamese division was, and I was in there, and the Colonel Nimothy was the advisor, and he asked me to come in and tell him how the operation had gone. And I told him about what we had done and how we had operated, and I mentioned to him about our battalion killing the prisoners, and I told him that I'd gotten after them. And he sort of got after me, saying, well, we're trying to get them to be aggressive. So I didn't say anything, but it sort of surprised me that he had taken that view of the situation.